You're listening to Overwatch Contenders Daily, your path to daily news, scores, and insights into the Overwatch League stars of tomorrow. Here's your host, LemonKiwi.
Fans, hope you're having a wonderful Monday, and I hope this video just makes it a little bit better. My name is LemonKiwi, and this is Overwatch Contenders Daily, where today's episode is a special Pacific region episode going over the grand finals, but most importantly, the history, the storylines, everything you need to know, either whether you're a new Overwatch fan or an experienced one that watches Pacific region. I've brought on Pixie to talk about everything you need to know about Season 1 of Pacific Region. But first, let's get into the news, where there's actually not news, but get your calendar ready, because there's a lot of playoffs going on in this coming week. For example, Chinese Region Contenders Semifinals is on Friday early morning, starting at 3 a.m. Eastern. There is no English broadcast, but you get to watch some Overwatch action. Who needs the casting? And the grand finals are on Sunday the 13th at 5 a.m. Eastern. For Korea, their grand finals is on Saturday at 1 a.m. Eastern. And to keep in mind that NA and EU semifinals in Poland start on Saturday the 12th at 11 a.m. Eastern. And the grand finals are on the 13th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern. But now, let's get into my interview with Pixie. So I'm here today with Contenders Pacific Region caster and loved personality, the Pixie, and that's how you know Matt. That's all I'm gonna go by. How are you today, Matt?
I'm good, and I'm glad you didn't call me Matthew. That's what my mom calls me.
You're not in trouble yet. So for those that missed out, back on Saturday, or you guys don't follow the Pacific region, I try to, but back on Saturday was the grand finals for that region between Detonator.Korea and Blank Esports. We did just interview someone from Blank, but anyway, both went undefeated during the regular season, and even until the playoffs, until they faced each other, where the series ended in a nail-biter 4-2 for Detonator.Korea. But I'm here with Pixie today to talk about the storylines and things you want to know about the region, the in-depth, juicy, well, I wouldn't say gossip, but the must-know about the region to follow the next season. So firstly, there's a lot of new teams, Pixie, that came into this season. So for the newer viewers out there, could you introduce these teams, or these newer teams coming in, and how did they perform in your eyes?
The bulk of this season was actually new teams. And of course, when we say new teams, that kind of has to be qualified because with OPC from last year now becoming contenders, teams from OPC were invited into contenders. The remaining spots were given to teams that qualified through trials, like in most other regions. And of the 12 teams in contenders, 8 of them were brand new. 4 of them from... Sorry, that's like 3 of them from Thailand. We had a Singaporean team in Chaos Theory. We had a new Taiwanese team in Logitech G Bang. We had a Japanese team in Yoshimoto and Count. And there is definitely one I'm forgetting. That's right, Talon Esports. Yeah, we had Talon from Korea.
So a lot of new teams. And, anything to... sort of anybody that surprised you, or how did they all fare in your eyes?
It was kind of interesting. It was pretty easy to pin most of them from the get-go, just based on how they did throughout trials. And also, to speak frankly, coming out of trials, there were actually some teams that would have, strictly speaking, qualified that weren't able to play in contenders because of the LAN setting. They weren't actually able to physically
couldn't
get
travel
to the location. Yeah, which has always been a bit of a I suppose a barrier for Pacific. And actually, for people who are wondering why Detonator.Korea play in Pacific, it's because Detonator is actually a Japanese organization that has already got all their team stuff based out of Taipei, so it's easier for them to actually get a Korean team into Taipei than to move all their stuff out to Korea. That's why that is. But there were actually a couple of teams that wouldn't have, strictly speaking, made it in. But that's kind of now a notion of the past. Like, moving forward, I would expect that those same teams, if they were to kind of go back to that same point with the experience they have now, probably would make it in, because now, of course, the benefit of playing against a lot of teams. And a lot of them were quite easy to pin. based on their results, like I said, in open division. A couple of the new Thai teams came through looking pretty decent. Xavier was sort of first among them, and that was reflected in them making it into the quarterfinals, where the other two did not. The other two being One Shine and Bazaar. I think the only real kind of shake-up came out of Chaos Theory, which were the Singaporean team. First time Singapore has had a team represented in the Pacific region. They did not have a strong start to the season, but they made some not like changes, but like they made some sort of adjustments in the background of things, not necessarily with the team and the roster, but like they picked up a coach who's actually working remotely out of the US. So I think I'm on Unsociable Hours. He is really putting in the work, and it just changed things altogether for them. It was a shame, but by the time that happened, they weren't quite able to make it into quarterfinals, but their win-loss record ended up being the same as the third and fourth place teams from their group. It was the map differential that unfortunately meant they couldn't make it in, but like by the time we got to the last week of play, they beat Machi like resoundingly, and Machi was a team that qualified for the quarterfinals and has been one of the longest standing teams in the region. So there's been a couple of shakeups here and there, and moving forward, I expect the teams that got relegated to requalify, provided they choose to play in trials. Of them, I'm really especially looking forward to seeing Chaos Theory across Season 2, because I think they really will dislodge someone from that top 8.
Well, yeah, Chaos Theory, I see here, finished 6-14 map count, where Talon finished 8-12. So just like 2 maps away from getting into the playoffs. So very, very close. But in terms of, so we talked about the newer teams, but there are some returning teams or some veterans of the region. And how do you think they have evolved from the previous Pacific tournaments?
Well, the returning teams, number 4 being, of course, Blank, who were in that finals, also Mega Esports, Hong Kong Attitude, and Machi. And there's sort of an interesting thing about all of them, because they all changed up their rosters a little bit, moving from last year to this year. And a lot of the roster changes were like old shot callers and sort of team captains moving on, or, you know, moving away from Overwatch or other sorts of things. So a lot of them actually had to make some really big adjustments. And most of this season, at least the earlier parts, were the teams just kind of getting back to where they had been as a team, and then trying to push further forward from there, which is kind of interesting, because being the returning teams, there's also like this notion of trying to beat your personal best in a way. You know, we made top 8 last time, let's try and make top 4, or we made, you know, we finished 3rd, let's try and make it into the finals, and that kind of stuff. And most of the teams had a decent season in that regard, which was cool to see. But at the same time, we didn't see, like, they weren't able to push the envelope, I think, as far as they would have liked if it had just been the same contiguous roster moving on through. But that's also just kind of the nature of the beast. And also, there is a bit of a quirk as far as returning teams go, because Detonator.Korea, we do consider them a newcomer, and certainly the roster is brand new. But of course, the organization, Detonator, actually had a team in Season 1 of OPC, a Japanese team that went by Detonator Gold, who were relegated. They then picked up a Korean roster that didn't qualify for Season 2. So in a roundabout way, you almost consider Detonator Gold to be one of the returning teams of the region. They just weren't a direct invitee from OPC because they weren't in it.
Well, all these returning teams or veteran teams have made it to the playoffs and still trying to beat their current high score, I guess, in terms of standings. But what has changed in the region since OPC Season 2, or for the new viewers, Overwatch Pacific Championship, which came before or sort of during Contenders?
Well, the big one is there are a lot less teams from Taiwan. That's a surprisingly major factor. During OPC, 4 teams, or strictly speaking, 3 Taiwanese teams in terms of the organization were present, those being, and these names may be recognizable actually to people who maybe know of, who follow some other esports like League of Legends, for example. Flash Wolves and AHQ both had teams across all of last year alongside Machi, and at the time Hong Kong Attitude were actually predominantly Taiwanese with their players. So a big change actually. Flash Wolves and AHQ had both been sort of within that top 4, with Flash Wolves actually appearing in the finals twice. They won Season 1, came second in Season 2. With those teams gone, actually the teams that hadn't quite made it in the past, such as Blank, for example, who lost to Flash Wolves in Season 1 of OPC, kind of saw the road ahead cleared in a way. There was a lot more space for teams that had been pushing to make it into top 4 actually achieve that top 4 finish. Like, in this instance, Mega, I would say, is a prime example. You'd almost count a Hong Kong attitude among that, only they actually made top 4 in Season 2 of OPC. So for them, there was almost this, like, this time maybe we make it all the way to the finals kind of thing, because there was so much more space within that top 4 kind of area. And then, of course, in among the returning teams, there was stuff in there. Like I said, a lot of major roster changes. I mentioned a moment ago, Hong Kong attitude. They are predominantly Hong Kong players now. They lost their sort of team captain, a guy called Holiday Cow.
That's a funny name.
Enough,
I saw that one.
Yeah, and funny enough, he's actually Shailen's older brother. So Shailen is still on the team. Similar things in Machi. I'm just, the name is escaping me right now, but they lost what was effectively one of their major shot callers. Blank as well. Gunba, of course, has now moved on and is working with LA Valiant as an analyst for them, and also RQT. And sort of between the two, they handled a lot of the captaincy side stuff. So a lot of these teams had to completely rebuild how the captaincy situation was, how the in-game shot calling worked. And they are also the teams that had the infrastructure to do that, but it was a challenge that they all inherently faced out the gate. So those were sort of the major shifts. That was sort of the scene set at the beginning of this year.
It seems like a lot of teams, even in Overwatch League, although the individual talent is there, the communication is always something that will be the biggest challenge for a lot of teams. And when you lose your main shot caller, someone who directs these team fights, it doesn't matter the individual skill. If you don't have the direction, it's a huge part of these team fights. And if you have to construct a whole new communication system, I can tell that can be a big change for these teams. But now going specifically into these grand finals where Detonator.Korea was the grand finalist, the winner over Blank Esports, which you had mentioned was amongst the newest teams to vanquish the region. So what about this roster makes them so much stronger than everybody else?
It's sort of, it's a manifold situation. First of all, I think I kind of want to dispel the myth of this being, you know, some tier 3, tier 2 Korean team and things like that, because that does get tossed around quite a lot when talking about this team. They have talent from a lot of places around Korea. Detonator.Korea, with their previous roster that they tried to qualify in for Season 2, that was a tier 3 Korean team. They didn't qualify in. Like, they just picked up a bunch of decent Korean players, some from, you know, previous teams and like the really low level stuff in Korea. Others, honestly, just like solo queue superstar type players, and they didn't make it in. So this is actually just a caliber of player that is there. In this particular formation, it's kind of working. Things are working, and it's kind of interesting. Last time the same thing came up, this idea of like, oh look, a tier 2, tier 3 Korean team just went into Pacific and smashed the competition. It was Ardent, who now have, I think it's 3 players from that exact roster that won OPC Season 2 now play in Overwatch League. The remainder are now pretty much poised to win Contenders China, and then of course the organization Ardent fused with O2 and is in the finals of Contenders Korea. So like there's this kind of myth, I think, and it is supported at times in results that like Koreans are just inherently better than every single team ever. But the reality is this is also a really good team. Like that's the thing that actually has to be mentioned here. Like I think it's kind of dishonest to say it's this tier 3 team that's smashing easy competition. That discredits the team. They're good players with good individual talent, and this isn't a particular mixture that's working. Detonator, the organization as well, is paying a lot more respect now to how to build a team. And that's the thing. They've failed in that aspect twice. First with Detonator Gold that got relegated with very little success. Like they only beat the other Japanese team in that tournament, and that Japanese team won absolutely no games whatsoever. And then didn't even qualify for Season 2 of OPC. So the organization has learned a lot. The players are decent players that haven't had much individual success on teams in the past. And they're now kind of hitting their groove, kind of finding what works. As far as some of the more specific things about the success goes, this is where having played in Korean tournaments actually really does help these players. And it's something we've kind of seen over Overwatch League. The Koreans right now do play the game to quite a different pace. There is a different kind of speed to it. And I think one of the reasons that it's the returning teams that had the most success against Detonator.Korea I think one of the reasons it was them was because they had actually played against Argent in Season 2, who had smashed them all, but they'd learned something from that. And we were seeing, Hong Kong Attitude took some maps of them. The finals was a legitimately close affair through and through until it did hit that point past the halfway mark where it's landslid the way of Detonator.Korea. So there is just sort of an experiential thing that has come from the scene that they've played in that is now starting to exist in the Pacific region because they have now had exposure to that style of gameplay across what has now been about 6 months.
Exactly. And there's just a higher level of competition in Korea. Their work ethic is just on a whole other level. Like, they work like 18 hours a day and they don't break a sweat.
And that's what they bring to the region.
Exactly. And every Korean player you see in Overwatch League is such a hard worker and on a whole other level. And not to give any North American players can definitely get up to that level, but just to the Korean, they're on a whole other level. Detonator.Korea there, but and also that interesting about Pacific region, how you have Detonator.Korea that are, you said, like Korean players, and you got Blank Esports that are Australian players, but you got an Australia region in Contenders, and you got a Korean region in Contenders, and they meet in the middle in this Pacific region.
Yeah. It's always been a bit of a quirk, actually, of the region. It's actually one of the things I like the most about the region, funnily enough. And, of course, during last year when it was OPC, that whole thing of, like, AU contenders being a factor wasn't there. So it kind of was the only place for the Australian teams. Like, if you wanted to really kind of push out of the Australian scene as it existed at the time, that was kind of the avenue to do it, which is what Blank successfully did. But, like, really Pacific is technically Asia Pacific as a whole, which includes China, Korea, and Australia, who all have their own scenes. But it's all the areas in there that don't have their own scenes that kind of need Pacific, being, Taiwan, all of Southeast Asia, Hong Kong being a great example. Strictly speaking, it includes like Polynesia and Micronesia and the Philippines, and Japan and all those other areas that don't necessarily have their own singular scene. So I kind of like that it gets a bit of that crossroads kind of thing going on.
Right, and now for the veterans of the region, we talked about Detonator.Korea, which was the newest team, but Blank Esports, sort of a well-known brand or a well-known name in the Pacific region scene, and it's lived up to its name of a top 3 placing team, maybe even expected to win the whole thing. So could you tell us a bit about this team's story?
Yeah, this season kind of did look a bit like their time, and it's a little bit of heartbreak to get there, but at the same time, they did at least get to return to the finals. But the history of the team is like, for those from Australia and New Zealand who are from that part of the scene, like, it like the back of your hand. Like, once upon a time, there was just this team of players that was smashing everybody. Funnily enough, they operated under the name Fusion Girls at the time. This is like early 2017. They started wanting to look beyond Australia because they were smashing with the competition. They went, if we want to take this further, we've got to look beyond here. And they were able to get into some Southeast Asian and Pacific tournaments. They were scrimming against Korean teams. Like, back in the day, and this was when they were predominantly that team that went to World Cup as Team Australia. So that was Gunba, RQT, Kiki, ATAR, I Eat You Up, and Trill. So that was sort of the original 6. And there had actually been a time previously where Hal had been on that Fusion Girls roster. And also there had been a time where another person called Yuki was on that roster in place of ATAR. But that 6 sort of ended up being the mainstay. That was the 6 that then went on to compete in the first season of OPC. And that was an invite-only season. So it was their results in other tournaments in the region, and also some of the notoriety they had actually built up in scrimming these other teams. Like, they were a known entity at the time, was what earned them that invite. And then the organization Blank was able to sort of get the backing and get them physically on location in Taipei to actually play in this season, where they started off looking really, really good as well. Like, they had a really big undefeated run. They went undefeated through the first round robin of season 1, suffered their first legitimate defeats. In fact, this time last year, they lost their first match of OPC, which ended something like a 100-something or other game win streak. Like, we're talking crazy numbers, right? And had to learn a lot about how to lose and then how to win and come back from that. Into season 2, they had some roster shuffles. Kiki went out for Huwu, who now means there's some New Zealand representation. And then ATAR was out for Huss. and they had some mixed success across Season 2. They spent a lot of time not quite gelling. Things were looking good, and both the swaps they made were just straight improvements. Sorry, Kiki and Atar. They're really great players, don't get me wrong. At the time, at least, like, just straight improvements. But there were some other things that just weren't quite clicking. During that time as well, they picked up Sexy, who you, of course, spoke to recently, as an analyst. And then, of course, moving into this year, Sexy has moved in to the main coaching role. Their previous main coach, a guy called Doctor, has moved into being the team manager. And they've also had these other sort of roster swaps. So they've now got this really weird mix of, like, 2 from the very first original lineup being Trill and IU up. They've got 2 from that kind of second wave of pickups in Huss and Huwu. And then, at least on the main roster that they're tending to field, they've then got another 2 in Tung and Kura. So that's kind of the overarching history of this team. But what they've kind of done is really set an example that a lot of Australian teams started pushing towards. And with Australian contenders now also being in place, there is this real arena for Australian teams themselves to also improve and get better. And also, for the first time, at least in Overwatch specifically, but realistically in esports in general for the region, there's kind of a path forward for Australian teams, because often it's been like, we're the best team in Australia, now what? And they go to international events, and you best and you learn a lot, get one like every 6 months. It was the extra step of like scrimming on Korean servers on crazy ping and all sorts of stuff like that's helped them to kind of push the threshold. And like, just to fully throw this one out there, like, there was a time where this team was beating GC Busan. This was before GC Busan kind of had their word, but it was that same roster. It was that original blank roster and that mostly same GC Busan roster, if I'm not mistaken. So like, there is a lot of skill in this region, but now there's kind of the same thing that Australia used to get of like, I'm the best in Australia, now what? There's this thing of like, I'm the best in Pacific, now
Go
what?
up the ladder.
Yeah, and for Ardian, as it turns out, you're the best in Pacific, now what? Well, half your roster gets picked up by Overwatch League. So there is now that sort of increasing, once you're at that top level, there is actually like, hey, I can now go toe-to-toe with some of these other teams from other regions.
So what are the chances that a team like Detonator.Korea goes to the Korea contenders, or these teams go to Australian contenders? Are they split off into all these different regions that they actually are from?
Blank would probably stay in Pacific, and I can guarantee you if they went to Australian contenders, they would win it no contest.
More money?
That is, and that's just, and the thing is, that's not to say anything ill of these other Australian teams. That is to say that Blank have been able to compete at this level for a year now. They've gained a lot of experience from that. The other Australian teams are catching up very fast because of the experience they've gained. And that's a really good thing. And like, hey, give it another year, I don't think I could quite say that same thing. But right now, like, that's kind of the situation. I would probably also wager, like, Detonator.Korea, if they were to go into contenders, they'd at least push into top 8, maybe push into a semifinal. It's a little bit harder to call at that point, just because I don't have as much of a direct comparison. Like, I very specifically know what results Blank has had against some of these exact Australian lineups that exist and things like that. So that's like, they'll stick into Pacific because the presence over the last year and the longevity of that has been a valuable thing for these teams now. And actually that is a level they compete at. I don't know if it's fair to say that like going into Korea is a step above or a step below. It's more a step sideways. And strictly speaking, the same is true of Contenders Australia. It's just that Australia, unlike the Pacific and Korea regions who had OPC and Apex respectively, hasn't had that year of like that particular kind of organized play. They've had some organized play, but not to that same extent.
Well, you might as well stick to who you're used to scrimming and where you're
Exactly.
used to practicing. And if you're at that level, there's no use to changing any. I was just kind of curious if they would move to Korea or move to Australia or get picked up to Overwatch League, what would happen? But for the final question, now we got to talk about these quarterfinalists. There's a Bang, Machi, Talon, Xavier Esports. Do they have a chance to getting to the top 4? Like, we saw Machi take a map at least off of Mega, but that was the only not 3-0 that we saw.
This is a bit of a tricky one because what I see happening long term with the region, as happens really with any region long term after your kind of initial season, is you'll get a twofold thing. You'll get better teams coming through the next run of trials, because there's a little bit more of a caliber to the scene. There's a bit more impetus to qualify and do well and all
New
that
meta,
jazz.
stuff
and
like
that
that.
means and that means you have to like play well as a team. So we'll see very good teams starting to come in, and like some of those teams will dislodge teams like teams like Talon and Abang and all that kind of stuff. Like, not to like specifically throw those teams under the bus, more just like generally speaking. And then some of those teams that made it into the quarters but not any further will have learned from this time and will remain a step ahead of new teams that come in, pretty much regardless, with the exception of like your Ardients and Detonators and all that have, the sort of zero to hero Royal Road type story. So we'll kind of get a little bit of both of those. As far as specific teams go, personally, I would see Xavier improving, like Xavier kind of being one of those stories, time goes by, improving. And I think a part of that is just because Thailand nationally is very up and coming in esports. The infrastructure is improving, and I think that will be reflected in the results of their teams, and of those teams, Xavier first among them. Logitech, Giabang have a lot of room to grow. This is not a professional team. Like, they're a bunch of students that play together and just happened to be good enough to, So, like, once they can start getting, like, they didn't have Logitech as a sponsor when they qualified. So, like, give them a bit more time and a bit more infrastructure. I see them maybe being a team that pushes ahead, or maybe that's where that exact same thing of, like, them not actually having been a professional team through this time will catch up to them. It's really hard to call. Machi is a bit of an oddball in this one because they are a mainstay. They've competed for a very long time, but they've also struggled now for a very long time. And that kind of worries me looking forward, because it's, if you've got all that experience behind you and all that time playing in the region, you've got teams like Mega who, with that time, have improved and have learned and grown and have pushed from just barely avoiding relegations in OPC Season 1 to now making it into a semi-final in this first season of Contenders just a year later. Machi have always sat middle of the pack, to the point where if things had fallen slightly differently, they might not have even been to playoffs this time around. So,
but have they made significant changes to their roster, staff, and
they have had some changes, but I don't know that it's necessarily change or rough change kind of thing. I mean, it's one of those troublesome things where, like, these aren't bad players; they're really good players. But something about the team isn't working. There's no, like, hey, just change out this guy for this other guy. I honestly think that, hey, maybe the roster needs to be rebuilt altogether, or it could just be one of those situations where it's a lot of great players. They're just not on the right team right now, and it's kind of hard to say. Or maybe this is going to be kind of the final kick in the pants. Maybe something else change. Maybe they'll find a way to kick into gear. They'll hit that X factor. They'll find whatever it is that's been stopping them from progressing and change things up for Season 2. It's impossible to call, but certainly this was, with these other mainstays of the region there anymore, they were one of these teams where it's like, hey, the way forward is clear. Like, this can be their redemption story after struggling through Season 2 of OPC. With a lot of teams that they'd previously played gatekeeper to, now surpassing them. That was Hong Kong Attitude and Mega over Season 2 that did that to Machi. Maybe this is their redemption story, but that didn't come to pass. Maybe Season 2 will be, but historically now, it's looking like it won't come to pass again, and you sort of wonder, what's the limit for this team? When do they change things up altogether?
I mean, there's a lot of changes either individually, there's synergy, there's the analysts behind it, there's meta. How are teams adapting to the ever-changing meta, whether it's Sombra, now Brigitte coming up, and there's just so many things that can affect a team and either throw a wrench into their gears, or some teams are better at adapting all around. And you see in Overwatch League, it's not even coming down to individual skill, it's now coming down to the mistakes in the game. And it's so tight in Overwatch League, but it seems like in Pacific region, there's a clear divide between, let's say, the bottom teams and the teams that are really fighting for the top.
Yeah, and it's a divide that naturally lessens over time, and as teams that don't cut it get cycled out and better teams come in, it slowly starts to reach that point where theoretically all competition is tighter, where, individual skill disparities aren't a thing, synergy disparities aren't a thing, and it starts to come down almost more down to, like, coaching and infrastructure and discipline versus coaching, infrastructure, and discipline of your opponent. And then, of course, how teams play on the day. I want to see Chaos Theory sort of push forward and prove. I do believe that they'll be in that particular crop. So eyes out for them moving forward. And sort of as for the rest of them, the top 4 have now proved their caliber at staying ahead like that. They've proved the worth of their infrastructure and the coaching and the analysis and their discipline as teams to practice. It's all the other ones that have to start to shape up to that level, or maybe it won't be season 2, but there will come a day where they just don't.
Well, the top 4 in the regular season stayed the top 4 in the playoffs. And of course, there is plenty of room to grow with roster mania and meta mania that changes every season. But that will conclude our interview. We did go a little bit over time, but this has been so much of a learning experience for me. And of course, probably to the viewers that have either never heard of this region or want to learn more about the Pacific region. So thank you so much, Pixie, for coming on today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you. Well, this was Overwatch Contenders Daily, and we're going to see you guys on Wednesday.